and I will
Hi,
let you
everyone.
take it away.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's such an honor to be here with you all. We're going to be talking a little bit about how we can unpack case studies from Ontario schools using an equity lens. And just a reminder, this is a really interactive workshop. So please feel free to unmute if you want to share something or put it in the chat. But we're going to learn together collaboratively. So I just want to welcome you. If you feel comfortable, you can introduce yourself in the chat. I know some folks have already started. If you want to introduce yourself, your name, maybe what your role is in education, that will really help us build a collaborative community. And maybe if you feel comfortable, what you're excited to share and learn today. Okay, while you're doing that, I'm just gonna start by centering our work in our land acknowledgement. So I would like to acknowledge the land I'm learning from today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also want to acknowledge that as a settler, I'm on Treaty 13. As a racialized person and immigrant, my educational experiences never really taught me the truth about these lands. I did not learn the truth about the injustices against Indigenous communities, nor about the resistance and resilience against colonialism and genocide. As I learn more, I'm beginning to understand how stories were used as tools for colonization. These stories perpetuated harmful stereotypes and were designed to rob Indigenous communities of their cultures, languages, humanity, and dignity. I'm learning that stories were used as tools for colonization, and in my work, I will strive to use and teach others how to use stories as critical tools for decolonization. These stories will restore the humanity and dignity of Indigenous communities. Through my teaching and activism, I'm striving to be an ally with Indigenous communities, an ally who listens, learns, and acts towards fairness and justice. Thank you so much for listening to that. As I was, sort of thinking and reflecting on my own role as a settler, I sort of thought about these three different points in terms of how I could, honor the land acknowledgement and situate my work within the land acknowledgement. So the first part was really, stating the land that I'm on, like researching and finding out what treaty I'm on, what name, the names of the land, and then stating my identity and connection and positionality to it. And then thirdly, stating my commitment and actions that I want to, strive to do in terms of, helping reconciliation or doing my part towards it. So thank you so much for listening to that. And I ask you to also reflect on how, you can bring this into your own practice. So our work today will really focus on, centering our work in an equity lens. So like really understanding the theoretical understandings and just reviewing that. We'll get into the case studies, and then there will be some resource share. And once again, it's a very interactive presentation, so please feel free to, share whenever you want to. And I'm reading all of the introductions, so thank you so much and welcome everyone. Our workshop will have some learning goals. The first part is, considering equity in relation to English language learners and multilingual language learners. We'll reflect on the importance of critically thinking about our own educator mindsets and its impact. And then we'll deconstruct some case studies to create more equitable outcomes. Just want to remind you of all of these, guidelines that will help us really work collaboratively today and, help us set us up in a good way. Okay, so we're going to get into the theoretical understanding. And, part of that, part of equity is really knowing your identities and really being aware of your positionality to the work, to the conversation, how you show up into the classroom. And so we all are made up of different intersectionalities. And so these are some of my intersectionalities, and these are, the identities that really inform the work that I strive to do, or the work that I want to do. And they also inform how I travel and navigate the world. So my pronouns are she and her. I'm a learner. elementary teacher, equity consultant, an aunt who really believes that, children are, mobilizing children and helping them, realize their role and helping them feel affirmed is something that we all need to strive to do. I'm a caregiver, a settler, a racialized Muslim woman who never really saw herself reflected in the schooling experience or even like the wider community. An activist who really believes that education is the way that we can really build inclusive and equitable communities for all people, and really a book lover. I really try to do my work through books by modeling how books can be used to help build critical consciousness. And so I ask you to reflect on the positionalities that, inform your work and how they inform how you navigate and travel the world. When we think about, equity, and we think about identity, and we think about how it positions us into the work and into the conversation, it's really about thinking about how some of your identities give you privilege, and some of your identities might, give you marginalized experiences based on, structures that are in place. And so, as a visible Muslim woman, there are places that, I experience disadvantage because of oppressive structures. But I know that my teacher identity gives me a lot of power, and it gives me a lot of positional power. And that's where I really strive to create change, which I hope will create an impact. And so I ask you to reflect on, the intersectionalities of your identity. How do they impact how you travel the world, your experiences in the world, and which identities give you privilege and which ones do you maybe experience some disadvantage? And as you position yourself, really think about, intersectionality, because we're not one identity. We're a bunch of identities, grouped together that really informs our experiences in the world. So my experiences as a racialized, South Asian Muslim woman is different than maybe a Somali Muslim woman. And so it's very important to know about the intersectionalities. And I know our work today is about case studies, but before we even get to the case studies, we have to position ourselves in the work. And that really involves, being aware and really being critical of our identities and how we show up in the world. And I'd like you to just, pause and reflect. Like, you don't have to answer these questions right away, but just pause and reflect on these questions, and just think about how it informs your work. So which identities give you positional power? Where do you experience disadvantage? Why? And how are you using your positional power as an educator to work towards more equitable outcomes for all students? So I'm just going to leave you with these questions for a few moments just to reflect. All right, and these questions will be embedded throughout our work today. And so, we talk about equity a lot, but what does equity mean in relation to, multilingual language learners? If we look at the Ontario Equity and Inclusive Education Strategy, it tells us that equity is a condition or state of fair, inclusive, and respectful treatment of all people. Equity does not mean treating people the same without regard for individual differences. And so if you take a look at the picture, you can see that equity is really about creating, fairness and justice for people of all identities and lived experiences. But at the heart of equity is a recognition that different people, based on, different experiences, will need different things to succeed. So that's really the core and heart of equity. And if we think about it in relation to our multilingual language learners, we know that they're coming from various identity groups, various lived experiences, and we know we want all of those students to be successful. And we need to recognize that different students and different children will need different things structurally and individually to help build themselves up so that all kids can really succeed. Here are some more pictures that really, you folks are probably familiar with because they're quite popular, but really thinking about equity. And, when we sort of like center an equity mindset, our hope is to work towards justice and liberation for all. Equity is really the structure through which we can work towards justice and liberation for all students of all identities and experiences. And so just in relation to, multilingual language learners, equity is really about creating spaces where all students of all identities and lived experiences are supported, they're given the resources and the tools and support to really reach their full potential. It recognizes that, people experience the world differently because of their identities. And it recognizes that, multilingual language learners are an equity seeking group. And, that helps us that informs our work, with our students. And once again, it recognizes that different students who might be coming from the same, family, same country, whatever it might be, might still need different things to help them succeed and, help them be on their way. And so, as we, consider equity, we also have to consider anti-oppression, because anti-oppression is really thinking about the structures that are in place, the structures that might be oppressive for some of our students. And so, it's really thinking about like, how are things set up? How are the policies set up? What are the rules like? What is seen as the norm? And how do our students of different identities experience these systems? And, our work towards, creating more equity or working towards equity is really thinking about, do our systems that are in place, like our school system, our healthcare system, or whatever system it might be, do those systems actually serve all people, or do they serve some people and, oppress other people? And so if we're working towards equity, we really have to think about how our work needs to be, on an individual basis, like thinking about our mindset, but it also needs to be considering the structures that are in place that our students are within those structures. And so it's important to consider how we can create more equitable spaces for all of our students, just, individually through our actions, our mindset, our language, but also through the systems within which our students navigate and are in. And so, this is really just sort of like a review of what we just sort of talked about. But really thinking about like, how is the ESL program, established in your school or in your school board? How does it, like, who does it include? Who might it exclude? How are students chosen to be in this program? So it's really thinking about all of those structural policies, decisions, and how that really impacts students and their lived experiences. And so, just a quick reminder of how we can sort of work towards an equitable and anti-oppressive approach is really to recognize that we have positional power. It's really to teach the whole child. It's to understand that different students will experience the world differently because of their identity. And it's really, a way to center an asset-based approach. So, what are our students bringing with them that's, already genius, and how do we continue helping them develop and grow in the new space that they find themselves in? And so I just want to invite you to our first Jamboard activity. I think it's going to be in the chat, the link. I think, Janet, if you're able to do that. Thank you so much. And in this Jamboard activity, what I want to invite you to think about is, how does adopting an equitable and anti-oppressive lens and stance, how can we adopt this lens and this stance into something that we do as educators? And so, we really recognize that equity and anti-oppression is not really like add-on, but rather it's the way we do all things. So I just want to have some, some talk around what are some of those actions we can take in our own practice, in our own school, that will really help us bring equity and anti-oppression, help us, move from the theory to practice. And so I'll just share on the Jamboard. I'll click it. Oh, I think, is it locked? Maybe.
Yes, it says unable to open file at this time.
Okay, I think maybe I might have to. Maybe I have to change the settings on it. Sorry, I might have to just stop sharing. Sorry. So maybe while I do that, we can, if you want to, maybe what we'll do, just for the sake of time, because I'm just looking at the time, maybe for the sake of time, what we'll do is we'll just reflect in the chat. Is that okay? And so, I just want us to think about what are some of those actions we can take that will help us bring equity into practice as, English teachers and, folks who work with English language learners. So maybe some of our actions, what actions can we take that will really help us work towards equity in our spaces? So maybe we'll just take 1 or 2 minutes, and instead of the Jamboard, we'll just reflect in the chat, if that's okay. And I'll just open up the chat. Thank you, Sula, for getting us started. Intentionally making space for home languages in your schools and classroom. Absolutely. Vimal, thank you for saying knowing our students really well. Absolutely. Knowing the intricacies of our students, their families. Thank you for saying that. Using inclusive language. Christine said create a welcoming and inclusive environment in our schools where students can see their cultures and traditions valued, absolutely, and represented. Tanya said, I think we need to get to know our students, their stories, family, context, likes, dislikes, goals. Absolutely. Thank you for saying that. Using students' lived experiences as learning opportunities, and knowing our students and using their lived experiences, what matters to them in our as a way to deliver our curriculum. Thank you for saying that. Building connections with students, absolutely. Seeking student voice and centering it. These are all amazing. Thank you everyone for just sharing your ideas and your voice. Creating affinity groups, conversation circles, right? CRP embedded into all of our teaching and learning, absolutely. Thanks, Atala. Including student voice, variety of forms of assessments, instructions, valuing different viewpoints, and really creating space to honor different viewpoints. Thank you for saying that. Using diverse text. These are all really amazing ideas. Thank you, Sula, for really reminding us that it all has to really do with finding ways to connect with families and building bridges, and reciprocating that, right? Really building the bridge, and because we have power as educators, maybe starting that connection. Thank you so much. And Atala wanted to add self-reflection, right? Really centering ourselves and being aware of our own potential biases and how that might impact our students, right? Thank you so much, everyone. Those are really amazing ways to really bring equity from theory to practice. And thank you, Tanya, creating a relationship based in trust and openness, absolutely. And some of our case studies today will really help us think critically about why that relationship is so important. So thank you so much, everyone. I'm gonna move on to our next little bit. And so, we've sort of established why, equity is so important, and you folks have really modeled how to bring equity from theory to practice. And, I want us to think about equity really requires us to make individual, group, and mindset shifts and changes. But it also, and, some of those individual, group, actions and mindset changes are being really aware of deficit language and how it shows up, really reflecting on if there's discriminatory treatment, how it shows up, phobias, neutrality, like educator neutrality, and why it's important to really be aware of our own biases and really remember that whatever we do as educators, because we have positional power, shows a particular viewpoint, and it honors or centers a particular way of knowing and being, while it might also decenter something else, being aware of stereotypes, microaggressions, prejudice. I think Atala said this a lot, but being aware of your implicit and explicit biases, and really being aware of inaction, because sometimes I feel it's very easy for us to get really nervous, and that can really what's the word, it can kind of make us feel really nervous in terms of acting. And so sometimes we might just become numb, or we might not know how to proceed. And I think it's okay, and it's natural. And I think it's important that we take some time to think about how we might act in a various situation, but it's very important that we come back and that we take an action, because not acting can have really harmful effects on our students. And just being aware of deficit language. And I'll share an example of my own. As someone who really tries to think critically about my language and just be aware, it was really so easy for me to also just engage or become or practice deficit language. One of my students was away for a few days, and the next time I went to pick her up for ESL class, instead of saying where is so and so student, I just said, oh, is she away again? And so what I want to model is that it's so easy to slip into this deficit language where instead of asking where is the student, or why might she be away, or how can I find out what happened to her, it was so easy for me to just sort of slip into that deficit language. And I think some of it is normal, and I think what matters is being aware of it, and then sort of thinking about my next time I'm going to be more aware of it, and I'm going to be conscious of how I'm speaking, because not only does it impact the student that I'm referring to, but it also impacts the culture and the environment that's fostered with the other students or with the other educators. And so, that was an example of an individual mindset shift, or just being aware and how that might impact. And so we know that equity requires these individual mindset shifts and really rethinking about our actions, but equity also requires us to think about those institutional and structural things. And so some of those might be the policies, the procedures, the rules, the norms, the structures, the practices that we kind of always do as educators who might be serving our population of ELL students. And so just understanding that equity will require individual shifts and actions, but also institutional and structural shifts. But at the same time, remembering that individual actions and structural changes, they're all interconnected, because everything is interconnected. And so today what we're going to be focusing on is these are just some quotes. I just wanted to maybe pause for a minute and just ask you to read these quotes and just think about how it informs your work around taking actions, because equity is about taking an action, it's about taking actions that's going to create better outcomes for in this case, our ELL students. And so I just want you to maybe take a couple more seconds to just look over these quotes and think about which quote resonates with you on a personal level, and maybe how it inspires you to continue thinking about how you're going to continue acting in your role. I'll just read the chat. Once again, working towards equity is decentering ourselves and, moving away from the fact that like we know everything, but really creating and opening that circle to bringing in expertise, like students, their families, community that's already in the room. Thank you for saying that. Okay, we're going to move on. So, what I want to remind us of is that we talked about how equity requires like individual actions as well as structural, and the case studies today will really focus on like the mindset shift, and it'll focus on like the individual actions that we can really take. So case studies are really powerful because they help us, they're kind of like a tool that can help us move towards equitable outcomes. And, if you're more interested in case studies, this is a really great book to like look through and consider how you can bring case studies to your own practice, maybe staff meetings, because the case study method or methodology is really an active like practice, and it's a tool that can help us work towards equitable individual and systemic actions for all of our students. I love case studies because they really help us center, listen to, and honor the voices of people who might be experiencing inequity, or the voices that need to be heard. It's a collaborative process where we can really see a range of experiences, different angles, and collaboratively we can build capacity and consider how we're going to act individually, but also like structurally. And case studies give us data, and data helps us create and implement changes at an individual and systemic level. And overall, case studies really help us think, they teach us, they lead us, and they help us advocate for more equitable and just outcomes for all of our students. And so today we're going to be using case studies as tools to help us consider these perspectives and help us move towards more equity. Most of these case studies are from like an Ontario context, and Ontario is so big and it's so diverse and dynamic. But what you'll see in the case study is some of the similar trends, similar things that might be happening. And it's really important to remember that, every school, every city, every school board is going to be different, diverse, but that there are similarities. And, with the similarities and differences, we can sort of use them, and we can sort of think about how the change that we might strive to create will look like in our school and our school board, and how it might look differently. And so these case studies, might be sort of like Ontario centered, but once again, we want to remember that, every school, every space is going to be different. And if we really want to work towards equity, we have to really remember that our work needs to be contextual to our students, to our families, to our, our location. And so I just wanted to sort of like, frame our case studies in that. And so our case studies today are really going to be focused on thinking about the individual, group actions that we can take to really, work towards equity. And, it's really important for me that we think about ourselves and our identity first, because who we are is how we lead. And whatever actions we take or the actions that we don't take has an impact on the people that we serve. And so, starting with the self, and then our next case studies will be really looking at the structural and how we can, bring about change in that. Okay. So we're going to be engaging in three case studies. The first case study we'll do collectively together where I'll model. And then the other two case studies, hopefully we have some time. We'll have a chance to maybe go in breakout rooms to discuss and then come back. And so I'll read out this case study for you, and then we'll think about how to deconstruct it. So in the mornings, Lisa's grandfather brings her to school. Today he asks to speak to the teacher and has brought his friend with him who is translating in English for him. He tells you that on the weekend, Lisa fell from her bike and sprained her arm. She's wearing a cast just to make sure everything is okay. Lisa is a new ELL student and is still adjusting to her new home and classroom. She started making friends in the classroom. You tell the grandfather that you will keep an eye on her and make sure she's okay. When you go to the staff room, some of the other teachers comment on Lisa's cast. One teacher says, their parenting ways are different from North American parenting ways. So just keep your eyes open for the future. So how do we, create a change this is a case study. This is somebody's voice that has come forward. How do we use that to really create more equitable outcomes for this student, but also, some of our students who might be experiencing this as well? I want to introduce you to kind of like a case study framework. And there's like 3 folds to that. So first is like to think. So reading the case study and thinking, what is the issue or the issues in this? The second step is to really center the feeling, like who has been impacted? How are they impacted? And then the third step in the framework is to really act. And this is where we're going to collectively think about 1 or 2 or 3 steps to ensure equity and anti-oppression. So we're going to get started. Before we get started, what are people's like responses to such a case study? Like have folks heard such like comments? And if you have, you can, put it in the chat if you feel comfortable. You can just say yes, no, like, is it a familiar story for some folks? Okay, while you're answering that, so some people have not heard this before, no worries. Thank you for sharing. And somebody else said very familiar. Thank you for saying that. Common. Thank you for saying that. So sorry, I forgot to mention that these case studies are, I just, designed these case studies. So no one's name or, experience is necessarily, it's not a specific experience, but they're just general case studies that, that I designed considering some of those, similar trends that we see in Ontario. Right, parenting style does come up. Thank you for saying that. Okay. So the first step is to really think about, what is the issue in this case study? And so I see, when I think about this case study, I see 3 different issues or 3 different, things that we might want to address. And so these are, I'll let you just, look at the 3 different things we might want to address. So one is, somebody already mentioned is like parenting. Another is like comments in the staff room. Another is, Lisa's grandfather has brought like a friend with him to translate. So these are some of the issues, or, the things that we want to pay attention to. If there's anything else, anyone sees, please feel free to unmute or put it in the chat. Okay, so let's think about, what is the issue? So as I was, thinking about this, these are some of the issues that I, thought about, but please feel free to, add more if you see more or, clarify anything as well. So, some of the issues are teacher bias, stereotype about student and their family's identity group, maybe parenting ways, parenting styles. And so it makes me think about like, what is the teacher value? Why? Like, what is the norm? How is something that might be different and maybe not the norm treated in this space? I see some deficit mindset and lens. There's also like a power imbalance between educators, student, family. It seems like there might be like a lack of relationship or rapport, or maybe there needs to be more some communication things like figured out more. How does building that relationship help you ask more questions respectfully? I noticed some prejudgment, and does this behavior discourage the family to come forward and to connect with the school? And another thing I see is the school and staff room environments and discourse, like what type of language are we using? And how does this language then translate into actions or inactions that might take place in our school? So these were some of the issues that I see in this case study. If you have any more, please feel free to put them in the chat. Thinking about reading the case study is one thing, but then deconstructing is really where the power is, because that's really how we can think about what is the issue and how are we going to resolve this issue. So, who is impacted is the next part of the framework. So these were some of my ideas. Feel free to add more. But the student, like Lisa, is impacted because there's a deficit view about her family. And then how do these like views, maybe it's not from her initial teacher, but how do these views play out in the schooling experience? The family is also like impacted. Does the family feel comfortable approaching the different teachers or the principal or the school? The student's teacher is also like impacted because how will she respond to this? How does she respond to this in a safe way for herself, for her students? Other teachers in the staff room might be impacted as well. Does it build like a toxic workspace? The teachers who might be making the comment are impacted because they seem to have like a deficit view. And the wider school community is also impacted because, how do these views then show up and translate into actions or inactions? So just some ideas there. And so how do we respond to this? These were some of my ideas, but I think when we're trying to respond and we're trying to act, it's good to have short and long-term goals because it helps us sort of break up our action and helps us like move towards equity. And so maybe the short-term goals can be, supporting the teacher in terms of how to respond to this comment in an asset-based way. Considering the ways in which, we're communicating with our families and building relationships. And some of the long-term goals might be, CRP training, really focused on classroom expectations, school expectations, relationships with families, work around, thinking about your individual bias, language, power of language, and, how will this work be centered in your specific context? So these are just some, examples of some of the ways to respond. But of course, there's going to be so many more ways that we can respond, whether that's individually, but also structurally. If there's any more ideas, you can please put them in the chat. But what we're going to do is we're going to break up for our first case study in our breakout rooms. Janet, would that be possible? Maybe.
Sure. I'm going to open all the rooms right now. Before I do though, I will just put the case study links
That
Is
would
that
be
okay?
perfect.
In the
Yes.
chat box? So I don't know how to be, I think I'm going to open the rooms so you can see where you are.
And we'll unpack them all together. So you might end up in case study 1 and case study 2. And so your job will be just to like read it and then respond on the Jamboard. And if that's taking too much time, just have some ideas to respond when we come together. Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Janet.
No problem. I hope this works.
It seems like it's working.
So far, so good.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think people are coming back.
I think everyone is back. We forced them out of their rooms. Sorry,
Perfect.
everybody.
Sorry, everyone. I know there's never enough time, but I hope you were able to start thinking and talking and reflecting. And so we'll just go over the 2 different case studies, just looking at the time. And so let's do the first one together. So I'll just quickly read out and then I'll have room 1. If you were in room 1, I guess case study 1, if you could just, if it's okay, you can share in the chat or you can unmute. So during the Remembrance Day read aloud and reading response activity, you notice that Gabriel is withdrawn, whereas he usually shows excitement and is eager to answer the questions. The following day, during the virtual Remembrance Day assembly, you notice that he's withdrawn and puts his head down on his desk. Other students tell him that his actions are rude, but when you do some more research by asking him and talking to his previous teachers, you find out that Gabriel's family came from a war-torn country. What can you do to support Gabriel in a trauma-informed way? How can you help the other students understand that his actions weren't rude? Anyone want to speak to this? Atala, go ahead.
I was hoping from somebody else from the group to speak. But so we were talking about one of our main points when we talk about some of the issues is that getting to know our students. That by getting to know the students, we would have known a little bit more ahead of time that this could have been a trigger.
Mm-hmm.
And there was also talk about making sure that we are even a little bit more well prepared when it comes to responding to trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Informed practices. So that was there was quite a bit of conversation in the group. So I'll let
That's
somebody else
amazing.
share.
Thank you so much, everyone. And I hope that it was just meaningful to talk and deconstruct. Anyone else?
I'll just add on to what Atala said. We were in the same room, and she made a really good point about creating opportunities where students get to explore their identities. And it can't just be a one and done. It has to be an ongoing conversation because you discover different things at different times, and students and teachers are ready to share different things at different times. So it goes back to what you were saying about it being an ongoing mindset and conversation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Sula, for adding that. And I saw some really great, responses as well. So thank you for sharing those. I'll just quickly deconstruct this one as well. Just, you folks have already really mentioned all of those big points, but, some of our issues were these ones that you folks really addressed. And some extra considerations to just continue adding on to what you folks are really already doing and thinking, but really getting to know all of your students and your context, which really has been mentioned and reinforced, communicating with families, reconsidering classroom expectations. once this situation has happened, if it's happened, touching base with the student and asking how they want to proceed in the situation, having a conversation with the class, but making sure that the student is not like singled out or pointed out, and so they don't feel uncomfortable. And also maybe thinking about, and reconsidering like school-wide assembly protocols and practices. Finding out if there's other resources and supports in the schools, like, the school psychologist, settlement worker, considering like safe spaces, alternative spaces during assemblies, and considering like school-wide trauma-informed practices, or PD, like you all have mentioned. And really considering like culturally responsive learning about war and the effects of war, and the experiences that different students might have in relation to that. And you folks have really mentioned this already, but like preparing students for Remembrance Day, materials, what it might mean, and really thinking about what this will look like for your student body in your classroom, in your context. What do you need to do? And what supports you need to get from, the supports that are like available for you to help your students, your classroom feel prepared. But really adding on to all of the amazing, discourse that you already had in your groups. And then just case study number 2, does anyone want to talk about this? So I'll just read it out. All of the ELL students are seen hanging out together in class. There's some students translating the work and the teacher's instructions for the others. One student says, "Why are they always talking in their language? Speak English." Another student laughs and asks one of the students, "What's your English name?" How do you respond? Any ideas for this group?
I'll just share one of the things we talked about was striving to normalize hearing different languages in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And we do hear this often, we were saying, especially when you have one kind of large dominant
Group.
other language group,
Mm-hmm.
but wanting to be constructive about it. And Minu can share. I'll let Minu share what she said about teaching, or was it Sharon, about when to use other languages or how to use them.
Thank you so much for getting us started.
Yeah, so basically, I was just quoting one of the examples. One of the teachers I know, she makes it a point to have the conversation with the classroom to use their first language for learning during the class time, but it's okay to use their first language for social interactions during break time. So having that very clear expectations so that first language is celebrated within the class, but it is mostly used for learning purposes. And also Sharon made a very good point about you have to have a sense of what is the purpose of using the first language? Are they using it to isolate the other people, or they're actually using it to their benefit to access materials? Those are the kind of conversations we had. Yeah, can't think of anything else. Anyone else from the group?
That's great. Thank you so much for really helping us think about like how it can become like a norm in the classroom, and just really like before casting a judgment, really understanding like the situation, the specific situation, and knowing the students and like why things might be happening. Thank you so much. Anyone else? So these are just some other, considerations, which, you folks have already said, but just rethinking the classroom and school community, ensure it's welcoming, like, what you folks said, like, making it part of the norm, and really rethinking how things are set up, rethinking classroom expectations, really centering and explaining the importance of translanguaging, thinking about how the educator might respond in this, because it will definitely send a message to students, the students who are, maybe speaking that language, but also the other students, and how we respect, or, you know, do we shut down what's happening? So really thinking about our educator response in this. And maybe considering like teamwork and collaboration learning opportunities for the whole group, and what that might look like. And, you know, discussing and reaching out to community and family supports to learn more about culture, cultural knowledge, why things, what certain actions might be taken in terms of, you know, the students are asking like, what's your English name? Like, where is that coming from? And how do we respond to that in a respectful way? And we can do that by going, you know, to the community. You know, they're the ones who have expertise in teaching us that, or teaching us what's happening. And so, you know, just as we end, thank you so much. I know we've gone over, but thank you so much for staying and all of your wonderful ideas. But really, when we think about equity, equity is really about action. So what actions are you individually taking that are helping you, you know, really bring equity theory to practice, that are helping you shift deficit language to really center your students, honor your students, celebrate your students. And, you know, I want to leave you with this quote: what you do makes a difference, and you have to decide what kind of a difference you want to make. As educators, we have positional power, and we can really, what we do has an impact, and we have to think about the type of impact we might be making for our English language learners, but also the wider school classroom, school community. And so these are some of, you know, resources that we can tap into to learn, continue learning more, because it is a process of becoming aware. And that's it. Thank you so much for, you know, being here, being present, sharing all of your amazing ideas. It was such an honor to be here with you today. And I just see one comment, co-creating a learning language policy would be a great classroom activity. That sounds really amazing. I think that would be so cool to do. Thank you for sharing that idea. That would be really cool. And I think it would set a really positive classroom environment.
Well, thank you, Rabia. I just want to say thanks to everybody for joining us today and taking time out of your busy schedules. And thanks, Rabia, for sharing and broadening our thinking around equity and how we can approach our practices, our planning, our structures, experiences, etc., through a more informed and equitable lens or mindset. So thanks, everyone, for coming out and joining us in the learning. It's so important, so important. All right, and that's it.
Thanks, everyone.